join with others in thanking the member for Warrington North for introducing the debate. And I would declare a somewhat of a different interest, Mrs Moon, in that my interest is of trying to hold the BBC to account for a long number of years. And some limited success in later years, but struggled in the early period to try and get them to be more accountable and to be more transparent. I note from the Culture, Media and Sport Committee's report that has been alluded to several times that, and this was February 2015, so almost 3 years ago, the tail end of what they said was, we do not see a long-term future for the licence fee in its current form. And that was almost 3 years ago. And given the change, the transformational change there has been even in those 3 years, in terms, for example, of Netflix and Amazon, how much closer are we to that point today than we were then when that report was produced? I suppose if I were to paraphrase what was said, I think probably 70 or 80 years ago, when someone said something like, an independent, impartial, fully accountable public service broadcaster sounds like a very good idea. Could we have one, please? Because I'm afraid I disagree with much of what has been said today. We have £3.8 billion of public finances going into the BBC and producing some very good programmes. And I pay my licence fee somewhat reluctantly, Mrs Moon, very reluctantly, because of issues I will come on to in a moment. They produce some good programmes and they produce some not so good programmes. But I don't have a choice. Unlike the honourable member, if I decide that I want to watch BBC occasionally or very rarely, I still have to pay. And therefore, it is the regressive tax that the honourable member for Warrington North alluded to. But the £3.8 billion is an out-of-date funding process. It is fast becoming a redundant exercise, as we see in the delayed broadcasting, which in 10 years has gone from 2% of viewers to 14% in 10 years. And as I say, with other providers like Netflix and Amazon transforming the viewing habits, I don't know where we will be in 10 years' time. I want then to move on to some of the not-so-good side of the BBC, Mrs Moon. For example, I don't know what it's like in other regions, but if you have complaints about programmes, and you have a series of complaints about programmes, and you write to the BBC saying, how many complaints have there been about X programme? They won't tell you. Have there been 5 complaints or 500? We can't tell you. It's commercially sensitive. I don't see why that's commercially sensitive. And if I found out there were 500 complaints rather than 5, I would be saying, well, why is that? Why is it like that? And I remember a few years ago, Mrs Moon, the issue in the immediate aftermath of the expenses scandal in this place. I remember with embarrassment watching programmes like Question Time. Whenever the presenter would turn to a senior politician, ministers, the present minister excluded, and ask them about what is their salary? What are their expenses? What do they pay on taxi fares? And each time I saw the politician squirm, instead of turning to the BBC presenter and saying, well, actually, my salary out of the public purse is in the public domain. Is yours, Mr. Dimbleby? My taxi fares are in the public domain. Out of the public purse are yours. And of course they weren't. But I never heard anyone challenge the BBC. The BBC, yes, I will. Yes.
Giving way, and the Minister may well be able to clarify this, but I believe, albeit I was listening to, I think, feedback on Radio 4, so we'll need to establish the source, that the BBC will now be required, I think it's an Ofcom requirement for, if there have been more than 100 complaints, then it will actually have to detail and also actually provide some editorial sort of view on those complaints. So it may well be that he's going to get more transparency that he asked for.
I thank the Honourable Member for that. I understand that that is indeed going to be the case. I just wonder why it hasn't been the case for years. Why was it that they had to be dragged kicking and screaming to revealing presenters' salaries. And when we did hear what they were, there was outrage at the disparity between men and women. And of course, as soon as there was outrage, it was then raised, when were they going to lower the male presenter salaries? Oh, no. It was, when are we going to raise the female presenter salary? So the BBC have a lot of questions to answer, Mrs. Moon. Hopefully we are moving very slowly, but possibly inexorably, towards greater transparency. If that is so, that is a good thing, a very good thing. Yes, I will. Yeah.
Just a note of hope into the proceedings. As Honourable will know, that the declaration of talent pay was a recommendation made by the Select Committee, which was accepted by the government and included in the Charter, and now takes place. So I think it shows that when we're very clear in voicing the reform we want to see, that it is possible to get it.
Yes, I thank the member for that, and I'm glad that that has happened. Some of us have been campaigning on that issue for many, many years. I'm glad that there's now some success. I want to turn, Mrs. Moon, now to the issue of commissioning. And I have been raising this issue within the BBC, external to the BBC, private and publicly with the BBC, because, as members will probably be aware, there is a commissioning process in the various regions of the BBC, and independent media companies, small and large, are entitled to apply to get commissions, as are people who work for the BBC. And many of them do. Many of them apply and are successful in getting commissions. And I have endeavoured to find out, well, if you work for the BBC and you've been there for some time, and you know how the system works, you know how the sound people work, you know how the video cameras work, you know your way around the system, does it give you an unfair advantage compared to those who don't? Again, we find it somewhat difficult to get answers. If it is the case that, for example, there are private sector companies trying to get on a short list and they're finding it difficult to get on a short list for commissioning, but other internal BBC companies, individuals, seem to get on the short list frequently, very regularly. Why is that the case? Can we have more openness and transparency about that? Will the BBC explain how that is the case? And, for example, if there are complaints within the BBC about the nature of commissioning, and I have raised complaints, and I am told repeatedly that they have a robust and transparent internal process to deal with that. Now, can you imagine, Mr. Yes, I will.
It's a really interesting point he's making about internal processes. And do you find that one of the issues they do have with the BBC is sometimes the first thing is always knee-jerk is just to defend, rather than actually, frankly, just be absolutely transparent in that regard?
Yeah, I thank the member for that, and I agree with him totally that that is the case. But, Mrs. Moon, can you imagine the case if a political party in this House, who's in receipt of public monies by a variety of sources, were to begin a commissioning process, and they said that they were commissioning various opinion polls and various other things that they were entitled to do with the money, and the BBC then came to a political party and said, we would like to question you about this, because there seems to be a lack of transparency about this money that you're spending. And we were to say to the BBC, we have very robust internal mechanisms to ensure that this public money is spent appropriately. Can you imagine the response that we would get on the BBC in saying that? And yet that's what the BBC say to me about their internal commissioning processes and the complaints that are engendered within that process. Oh, leave it to us. We know how to spend public money. We know how to account for that. And we have very efficient internal BBC employees to ensure that that money is accounted for. Not good enough, Mrs. Moon. Not good enough. Yes, I will. Yes.
If on that point of commissioning, he makes a powerful case, but would he accept that all BBC programmes, both new and repeat, outside of news programming require competition in the commissioning process. And in fact, since these changes came in the Royal Charter, the most high-profile case of recommissioning was actually the recommissioning of Songs of Praise, which BBC Studios lost to a commercial competitor.
Yes, again, I thank the honourable member for that. But I come back to this. Whenever we have complaints about a commissioning process, it would be infinitely preferable if the BBC would open up their system so that if they have a fully accountable, transparent system of assessing the commissioning process, we can see what it is. We can analyse it, we can look at it, we can say, is that value for money for the licence fee payer? Or is there something else at work? I don't know that there is, but I know there have been complaints. And I know there needs to be greater transparency. In short, Mrs. Moon, to conclude, I think the BBC used to be a wonderfully independent, impartial public service broadcaster. I want to see it return to those days. I think it's fallen short in recent days, and I had a debate in this chamber in recent months along similar lines, and I think we need to keep pressing the BBC. We need a wider debate about if we were to move away from the licence fee, what would be a better way of doing it? And I fully concede there are no simple, easy solutions, but we need accountability and transparency of almost £4 billion of public money. Thank you.